Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very sunny night. My name is Julie. I'm the director of photography at Messens London, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Michelle Angwenyi. Michelle is a writer from Nairobi, Kenya, whose writing explores time and memory. She was shortlisted for the 2018 Brunel Africa International Poetry Prize and for the 2017 Short Story Day Africa Prize. She's the author of Gray Latitudes, selected for the new Generation African Poets Chapbook series. And she's a Center for Arts, Design and Social Research Fellow. Before we start, I should say that there will be some time for you to ask questions. If you'd like, there is a chat section on the Zoom call that you can use to write any questions, any comments you might have, and I will read them at the end of the presentation. Before we start, I should explain a bit more what the exhibition is about. So we were very happy to work with Michelle on a text in response to the Karen Blixen archive, which is now exhibited at Messens London on Cork Street until the 11th of June. This archive is a selection of 15 pictures taken by Thomas Dinson, Karen Blixen's younger brother, during his successive trips to Kenya between 1921 and 1925. And those images were either stored in family albums or sent to Denmark. So the way they have been used was to kind of illustrate their daily life there. And some images can appear quite bucolic or free-spirited, but they also are marked by colonial power structures at the time. And the book Out of Africa was published when Karen Blixen was back in Kenya. And the film followed as well in 1985. Michelle will talk about her text in response to the Karen Blixen archive, and a notion that I find very interesting is this notion of dream space. So very happy to introduce you to Michelle, and we could start, I think.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Right, there we are. So I'm really excited to talk to everyone a little bit more about my response to Tales of Africa. And I think Julie has already talked a little bit more about some of the things that I try to explore in my writing. But before I get there, I think I'd like to speak a little bit more about what I thought of first when I was approached to write a response for this. So there's this quote from John Berger's Ways of Seeing, which is that every image embodies a way of seeing. And it's a simple phrase, but one that in a way carries a lot of weight about how we choose to see things and what we choose to see. I have a friend who often asks me what I have seen or what I am looking at, and how I respond to that question often tells a lot about what it is that I also am not looking at and what I'm not seeing, and how these words can be described in any number of ways. So to come to the exhibition space and to think about the images that Karen Blixen shows us, we tend to see a woman, an aristocratic woman, removed from a place of aristocracy, but still maintaining a lot of that still. And so she's in a country that she does not belong to. And yet she holds on to a certain way of seeing, and a way of seeing that ties into what I like to refer to as a dreamscape. So in my writing, I think a lot about memory and time. And I believe that dreams are woven very deeply into memory and time. And I think about the ways that perhaps Karen Blixen would have liked to remember herself, and how she would have liked to remember herself while in a particular place. So this place takes on a particular timbre, it takes on a particular tone, it takes on a particular kind of dream form, because she's expanding her memory, she's expanding her time into places where she might not have been, but that she can exist in. And these photos tend to capture that. And I think that's what plays into a lot of the romanticism that people who have engaged with Karen Blixen in one form or another tend to love. And it is that romanticism that also kind of created a sort of landscape for other people, especially white people, to come to Kenya and picture it a certain way. She's already opened the door into this particular way of seeing, into this particular dreamscape that other people can also participate in. And it becomes a shared dream, but one that is devoid of the people who actually inhabit it as a reality and as a solid reality. So looking at these pictures that I selected from the exhibition, and it's something that I've had a conversation with Julie a little bit about. I tried to look at the differences between the photos taken of the Africans who she found and the photos that she takes of herself. There's a certain, I don't want to call it stoicism or stiffness, but there's a way of presenting Africans in a way that feels very specimen-like. It feels like you've stepped into, say, a lab or a museum, and you're there to look at something under a microscope. There's a vibrancy that's present in the photos that, you know, she or her brother took of their particular dreamscape, and we see how the Africans fit into that as kind of part of the backdrop. And so this is something that moves into the visuals that we see in like the film Out of Africa. And I believe that it was at this point that people began to see this image of Kenya or of Africa at large that presented to, say, people in Europe or people in America, a very different view of what it was like for the actual Africans who lived here. And so it's very important to consider some of these things and how far they travel, especially when you think about it through the point of view of it being a kind of foundation. Because at that point, you can tell that, you know, documenting things visually was very new, and it took on a whole new importance that then proliferated around the world. And so for that to be the initial basis for the visuals or for the dreams that everyone else in the world would buy into, it was kind of a pivotal moment for everyone at the time. I'm very interested in photographs because they accommodate a lot of my interests, and the interests that I mentioned, of course, of time and memories. And this is a quote from something I'd written before. So perhaps better than the photos we take are the photos we do not take, but that like many other photos are kept somewhere, framed somewhere, more fluid and enduring in their form, like dreams. And so looking at that, I tend to think about how the things that are left outside the frame perhaps tell us more than what is inside the frame, and how those things are captured in our dreams. Our dreams, or what appears of our dreams in the photos we take, or the images we choose to look at or to focus on, there's a lot more outside of that that feeds into whatever is captured in the frame. And that is what I think I would like to focus on as we continue in this conversation. So, sorry. This is a photo by one of my favorite photographers. His name is Stanley, and he was active in post-colonial Africa in the 60s and the 70s. One thing I love about his photos is that, in contrast to what we saw, and understanding that, of course, these were photos taken in different decades when technologies were also different, but yet there is a way that the Africans in these photos occupy a larger dreamscape, and it is one in which they control the narrative. They're on both sides of the microscope, or the camera as it may be. And as you can see from this picture, this man or woman or person has the freedom to decide, even in that tiny little square foot of a studio, they have the freedom to decide where to go and who to be. And all of those dreams are captured in this one photo. There's so much you can begin to imagine about what is happening outside of this photo from a photograph like this. And so I think I'm going to read out the first quote that I wrote. There is a continuous construction of self in all of these images, one that affirms of the photographer and his subjects an unshakable shared dream, the way of seeing themselves. And so for me, I think it just goes back to how one sees themselves, or how we all tend to see ourselves, depending on the communities that we belong to. I think it's very important to always consider that whenever we encounter images. We have all grown up with different backgrounds, with different experiences. And I think that these tend to coagulate in what we choose to see or what we choose to ignore, or the intersections of these as well, because I feel that what we see and what we don't see are two things that are very closely related, possibly on opposite sides of the spectrum, but kind of coming back together like a circle. And so for me, I feel like writing about photography, and especially considering how these things come together in the new age, there's a really big juxtaposition between how life was during Karen Blixen's time and how she chose to document that, and how I see myself today as a Kenyan and how I choose to see myself. But yet we see that a lot of those ideas from that time continue to endure to date. And it's just as I talked about how at the time taking photos was something that became a really important way of documenting life and talking about this life and spreading the idea of a certain kind of life, of connecting to this shared dream that other people in other continents might have had or might now have because they saw a certain image. And I begin to think about what that means when there's a tension today between those ideas that continue to endure. When I look at the same place, at the same images, and I see something completely different. So that's where you begin to see that the world tends to split apart, and it seems that we tend to exist on different timelines, we tend to remember different memories, even if everything was happening at the same place, at the same time. And I think this boils down to who took these images, why they took them, and how they chose to present them again. Okay. This is another really nice photo I like. that, I guess could also contrast with the image of Blixen or her family and friends atop a horse. And then say 50 years later, in a studio, there's no massive backdrop, there's no landscape of trees, there's no vast grassy plain, but there's a man here looking every bit like the superstar he is, on a motorbike, in a studio, even in a tiny town in Guinea-Bissau in Western Africa. And I begin to think about how powerful such imagery can be. So Sanley's photography stands in stark opposition to that of Denison in Kenya, as it frees a photographed subject from a bleakness rising from the restrictions that the visions of others can impose, one that almost renders the subjects inanimate. I think this is something that, again, is really important to me whenever I think about memories, whenever I think about photographs, and whenever I think about time, because I tend to think about it as a thread that stretches back and forth endlessly. And for me to look at an image that Sanley took and to feel that thread connecting to the thread that I occupy in this time, there's a certain dynamic strength that these photos have. And again, even visually, even like in the sense of the actual state of the photo that was taken, say by Karen Blixen, of these Kikuyu people lined up in very strict lines. I think there's also something to be said about that, how you choose to represent these people, whether in both cases, so in both the Denison or Blixen case and the Sanley case, people are posing, but these poses also tell you a lot about how tightly held you are or how free you are to move. And I think that's also something to think about, because that also ties back to the ideas of how we dream and how we see ourselves. It's a performance at any time. I think photography can be a performance. And I also feel that how we perform tells us a lot about how we feel we can perform or who we are. This is a collage made by an artist in Kenya, and that ties back to what I was talking about, the dynamism of these photos. For something from the 70s to make its way to 2021 and still maintain this vibrancy across the continent, across archives that are very difficult to find, I find that to be very illuminating about what photography can mean to people, and especially to Africans on the continent. How you see yourself or how others see you makes a difference to how you continue to engage with that work, or how else you feel about bringing that into your space. I think that's something that's really important, because images can be very powerful. Again, tying back to the idea of time and memory, images, whenever I think about them, I think about how the memory is unfinished, for as long as the image is there, you are continuing to interact with this image or this photograph for as long as you both shall last. And I think that that's something to really remember every time we encounter images, how they stay with you. This is a quote about Karen Blixen's legacy in Kenya. and her ties to how Kenya has been seen as a safari destination, and also how that perpetuates certain colonial era notions of what the African continent is or the African people are. I think a lot of the time, Africans in these photos tend to occupy the back, like they are the backstage, they are the backdrop, they are not people, so to speak. We know that today there are so many Kenyans who have been dispossessed of their land because of this particular romanticization that gave settlers permission to come into a country and occupy land that did not belong to them and ignore the people who were there, and instead focus on the things that they felt gave them a right to be there. Currently, in Kenya, conservation is a very fraught industry because of how there's a focus on conserving, say, an elephant or a lion, ignoring the fact that there are people who have lived for centuries with these animals. And the question becomes then, who are you conserving these animals from, or for? And so it's a very difficult conversation to have because of how entrenched these ways of thinking have become since colonialism, and also due to the proliferation of imagery like Blixen's. And it's difficult to step out of that mind frame because this is now the system. And I think that just speaks to how powerful imagery can be, photography, the stories that they tell, how we choose to see people, how we choose to dream, how we choose to continue, or how we choose to engage with the memories that we leave behind. I think those are some of the questions that would be really important to answer if we were to be very honest with ourselves about what it means to exist in a Kenya today that has come from a very, very fraught history. And yeah, so I think to end this, these are just a few images from the Karen Blixen Museum, Nairobi, which is in Nairobi. Coincidentally, today my Uber broke down right in front of this museum. I don't know what to make of that. But what I know about this place is that a lot of what we see inside, a lot of the artifacts, this was a lot of it is exactly as it was in the 20s. And there's a very sharp juxtaposition between this grand life that Blixen lives then and even today, and the lives of Kenyans in Nairobi today as well. So it's something that gives me pause, to kind of think about what it means to preserve this house, to preserve this memory, even when we Africans are now the ones in charge of it, even when we should have the power to decide how we would like to be seen. But again, it just goes back, to that very powerful nature that photographs have, or that very powerful nature to create a dream or to create an image and to have everyone buy into it. And also what that image itself obscures, because I believe that these images obscure something else that we do not necessarily confront in the day-to-day. And that is something else that I'd really like I think for all of us to think about, images show us things, but what do they obscure as well? And yeah, I think for me, that is what I am now starting to think more about, even as I might imagine that I have this dream, I have this way of seeing things, but what don't I see? Or what is this dream? Where is it not going? How has imagination failed me even in my dreams? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's really interesting hearing you speaking about this story and this legacy. I'm just reminding everyone that there is a chat section. If you have any questions, feel free. And before we open up to the questions, and I just wanted to just ask you a few more questions about this, because I find this museum quite interesting, because apparently it was preserved as it was, as you said, but there's also tropes from the movie which were used in the room, in the way the room is preserved and maintained. And I think it's so interesting the way in which this film, this fiction, has really filled into the actual house, the actual museum, and the way this story is remembered. And I'm just quite curious to know a bit more about where this museum is located in Nairobi. Is it part of like the curriculum? Do people would go and see this as schools, for instance, or is it something quite separate? I would be quite curious to know a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So the Karen Blixen and her legacy is not spoken about at all in school curriculums. Whenever the idea of colonialism is approached in syllabi, it's always approached from, say, this was a beneficial thing, this brought ABCD to the country, this did this and that. And so it's very difficult to also confront the uglier side, which I guess is painful and is easier to ignore, but also because there are people who still benefit from that, even if they may be Black, even if they may be Kenyan. And these are the people who are in charge of the country. And so it benefits them to continue to hide some of these painful realities that people still confront to date. The Karen Blixen Museum is located in a suburb of Nairobi called Karen. And you might guess that indeed it was named after Karen Blixen herself. So this is where she lived, and this is where she owned thousands of acres. And she had a coffee plantation in this very place where she hired Africans to kind of, take care of the crops and harvest and all of that. And so when she left Nairobi in the 20s, following, the global economic crash, she sold all of this land to a gentleman who then parceled it off to people, his contemporaries. And most of these, again, were white settlers who, to date, still live here and still continue to promote the ideals of a time that probably is over 100 years now ago. And so I believe you can already begin to imagine the tension that exists between the people who live here as descendants of the people who lived there in the 20s and the 30s, and the Kenyans and Africans who this land once belonged to and who cannot access it in the same way as they may have. There is a sense that this land has been made in a way that serves a particular demographic. And yes, you could be Black, you could be Asian, you could be white, but then again, if you're not white, you have to position yourself or, pander to a certain ideal just to feel as if you belong, which is a form of erasure in and of itself. So that legacy endures to date. Yeah.
Okay, and also I think I find the timing quite telling, right? Because the film was released in 1985 and the museum opened a year later, and as a kind of tourist attraction. And as you rightly pointed out, I mean, not only the book, of course, but also this the museum kind of together create a whole imaginary around what Kenya is supposed to look like from an outsider or tourist perspective. And I'm also quite interested about Sori Sanley's pictures, right? Because these were taken in the 60s and 70s in West Africa. And I think it's just quite helpful to remember that as soon as photography was invented in Europe, it was used in Africa. So the story of photography in Africa is as old as it is in Europe. And the photography studios, I mean, were like a very famous event from, right from 1910, even before that, as just to memorialize specific events, weddings, family reunions, but also to project specific image, create those images, curate them as a kind of not a reciprocity, but to imagine something together between the photographer and the photograph subject, which is different, as you pointed out, to Thomas Dinson's pictures. But at the same time, what I find interesting when I saw those two pictures together, even if they are very distinct in time, they both, in both pictures, you understand what kind of image both photographers wanted to project. In both, when you think about dream space, I think it's such a very interesting term to talk about photography and to talk about those set of pictures, because in this term is a very interesting way to enter and to think about the way people represented themselves and what kind of stories they decided to tell, and what kind of vision of the world they had and was shared among others people at the same time. It's a very interesting document of a specific place in a specific time as well. And I'm just thinking just about dream space and your journey as a writer and interest in photography. I mean, how do you feel that photography and literature are similar in the way that they both create this dream space? I mean, do you write? I think you write about photography quite a lot, but as a writer yourself, I'm quite interested about how you're thinking about this dream space.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there's a certain way that, I mean, we've all heard that a photograph is worth 1,000 words. And I feel like in the same way, literature can and does occupy the same dream space that photography does, because I think literature can offer a snapshot of the current, perhaps where a nation is at a time or where an individual is at a time. And so focusing, say, on a writer's work and seeing the trajectory that it follows is almost the same as like looking at a series of photos taken over a long period of time, or like a certain period of time. And you'll be able to pick from each of those things certain details about a time and a place, what people were thinking, where they were going, what they felt they needed, who they were around, what mattered to them. And I feel like there's a very close linkage between the work that a photo does and the work that a piece of literature does. And I think even more interestingly is when the two collide in like one document. I was reading a book by an Ethiopian writer. Her name is Maza Mengiste, and it is known as, the book is The Old Drift. It came out last year. And in it, she she describes photography of Ethiopia, like photographs of Ethiopians taken during a particular time and space, during the Italian invasion in the 30s. And it is so striking because you almost begin to imagine that this is like one singular piece, how they tend to bounce off of each other. It's just really striking to me. And yeah, I can say that there is definitely a very strong link between photos and literature.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. There are actually a few questions from the audience. Wow. Okay, amazing. Okay, we have many questions. Let me start with the first one. Could you say more about what Blixen's image obscure about contemporary Kenya in her time and currently? Should we start with this one?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, definitely. So I think Blixen's images obscure about contemporary Kenya. They obscure the very dynamic nature of the people that we have here. You'd look at a picture that Blixen took in the past, and already in your head, you're thinking that it's like the word or the image of what an African should look like is a very complex thing. But I feel like her imagery reduces who the African is, say, to a certain point in history that can only always be looked at retrogressively. There is a tendency for Africans to not exist in the current time and space, or if they do, it is only as like a matter of interest and not as a matter of personhood or ownership of the world that we live in. And so I think that Blixen's and several of her contemporaries have also taken images that just tend to, reduce the African to a postcard or to a National Geographic image or anything like that. And at the same time, there are contemporary Africans, there are contemporary Kenyans, whether they look like that or whether they look like something totally different. And what I'd like is for us to remember to continue to complicate this imagery, because to reduce it to just one thing tends to obscure the actual lives and the actual complexity of what being a Kenyan and a Black Kenyan right now is. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's also a question about, just reading the comment, fascinating to hear a discussion of the, in bracket, post-colonial gaze, individual agency and ownership or not of their image. Seeing the photo of the Kikuyu men, might not some of them have served in the KR and themselves had experience of other places and context? I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, actually, because one thing that I wonder about, again, because of so much of how much this history is obscured, is the stories of people who served in the KAR, the King's Africa Rifles. And that very, very complex legacy that they leave because of the tension that they have being, say, home guards and having to snitch on their fellow Africans who are at the same time trying to fight for the very things that they were preventing them from. And so that is part of a complex history. That is part of a complex history that is often simplified to, okay, we have Africans who are for their freedom and those who are against their freedom, failing to consider some of the things or some of the reasons that might have forced Africans into, say, being home guards, being part of the King's Africa Rifles. It was all a matter of survival, I believe, and how people chose to survive in a very difficult time is something that is not talked about enough. And I feel like those are some of the stories that we are only very recently coming to hear. I know that there are people alive today who might have been in the KR or the Mau Mau or whichever other community of people or whichever other alignment. And I would love to dig deeper into some of these histories that, again, are obscured by bigger or broader generalizations about, who the Africans were or what their roles were at a particular time. I feel like those are some of the stories that would help us understand the relationships they might have had, say, with Blixen or with people like Blixen, and to think about what their relationship to, again, photography as well might have been.
Thank you. There are two questions that are a bit related to each other, so I'm going to ask them together.
Okay.
Are there any African or Kenyan Indian contemporary accounts of Karen Blixen's farm or other white-owned farms? And the same kind of question is there any evidence of local people's responses to Blixen, especially to her book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are good questions. I have not, as far as I know, seen any African or Kenyan Indian accounts of Karen Blixen's farm or white-owned farms. But what I do know is that there are people right now who are documenting, say, what follows after Karen Blixen, because as we've talked about, whatever or Karen Blixen's legacy brought on a slew of settlers who came into Kenya and settled in various places. One of them is Laikipia, where thousands and thousands of acres are held by one person under the guise of conservation. And people are beginning to talk more about this and document it, whether through journalism or whether through books. I know there's a book called the Conservation Lie that documents this history of land ownership and the tension, between the Africans who own that land and the white people who came to take it. So yes, I would say yes, there are African accounts. I'm not sure about Blixen's, but of other farms, white-owned farms, yes, there are. And for the other question,
it was, is there any evidence of local people responses to Blixen, her book, for instance?
I know that there are blogs that people have written, but again, I also know that there's a tendency for people to not want to engage with topics that they know might already, they already know, it's been summarized for you. And there's a kind of general consensus that this might not be how I would like to be represented. This is not the kind of story I'd like to hear about myself. But yeah, I would actually be really curious to know if there's anyone who's actually done some research into her book or the film and what they would have to say about that.
Thank you. Are you right for two more questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
It's interesting. Why do you think Blixen is better known than Lady Susan Wood, whose legacy is probably greater than Blixen's? I must say that I don't know Lady Susan Wood, so I'll be happy to know more about her.
So I do know Kazuri beads, actually, and if I'm not wrong, they employ African women to make beaded jewelry and sell it for income. I think here, maybe the question is not why Blixen is better known than Lady Susan Wood, but perhaps how these legacies are intertwined in their own way. I feel like we know that Blixen perhaps like Lady Susan Wood, also engaged with the people or the Africans around her in a quote unquote loving way. She spoke about, say, her cook or, the servants who worked with her. She spoke about them beautifully. And yet there's still that issue of, why are you here on my land? And why am I your servant? I think that is what needs to be confronted a little more, because were it not for this strange idea of colonialism, or the strange idea of a foreigner knowing what you need better than you, I feel that we would be asking ourselves a very different question here, because Kazuri beads has probably, created a lot of income for a lot of women and continues to do so. And that can never be a bad thing. What I feel is that the real question we need to ask ourselves is, why did these women need to have this income from this particular person at this particular point in time? And whoever possibly was at the start of this trajectory was Blixen. And therefore we think about Blixen when we think about this system that puts white people at a higher level than Black people, and therefore can, uplift them or give them a source of income or make their lives better. But what is that system? And, how do we confront that? Why is it there in the first place? Yeah.
Thank you. And there's one question that is the last one. Interesting question. Was the colonial lens an absolute power, or was there some measure of collaboration? Did the subject, this photographed subject, have choices too, or was the reality that their images were used to create a fiction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I believe there were choices that people had, but then again, there were limited choices in a sense, so to speak. You can imagine, again, going back to the idea of survival. If you want to protect yourself and to protect your family, collaborating might have seemed like the easiest way to do it, because people were being killed for not collaborating. And so there's, again, okay, we have images that depict these people a certain way, but how far do those images go in telling us the complete picture again? So yes, they had choices, but again, we also don't know how those choices were depicted in the images that we see. And again, how those choices were talked about or continue to be talked about through the history that we are shown, and the history that we have to dig up for ourselves again. And I feel that within the archive, there are so many places we can go to complete this picture. But as it stands, it's really difficult to do so, because, we see that, and we have heard that there are a lot of classified documents that the British government recently, was it in 2013, that they uncovered but destroyed. And we ask ourselves, what was in those documents and why did you destroy them? And that's why it's difficult to talk about who occupied which position at which time and how and to what extent, because the picture is incomplete. But I feel that these are stories that are really important, you know, to keep digging and keep asking. And at the end of the day, I think what's important is to know that there's a big complexity here. As with any people, the choice to collaborate or not is often based in something bigger than the person themselves. Yeah.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting to hear you speak about all of those backstories and like to the images really, because I feel that and people, you know, everyone is welcome to come to the gallery and see the pictures. I think that you really provide a very interesting story and very highlight interesting issues to consider in looking at those images. And what you mentioned about what is inside the frame and what is outside the frame, what you choose to show and not show, is really, really interesting with this archive. There is someone interested to know a bit more about conservation in Kenya. Without entering into too much detail, I wonder if there is any sources that people could read about, anything that you would recommend, any books about on the topic, or any articles that people might want to read.
Yeah, sure. I think the book I mentioned earlier, The Conservation Lie, would be a really good place to begin to think about, I guess, conservation from an African point of view. And also, yeah, I think that would be a good starting point that also has a lot of other references so that people can go down their own tunnels. But yeah, I would say that's a really good book to begin with.
Thank you. There's one more question. Can I ask you, there's just one more question. Is there much of a national archive in Kenya about the British period? I think it's a question of how archives are being stored, or if there are any in Kenya about this specific part of history.
Yeah, so, okay, I would say that there are very fragmented archives in Kenya as we speak. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of them tend to be tied to individuals. I know for one that there was a politician who died named Joseph Murumbi, who kept a lot of, say, pre-colonial artifacts from Kenyan communities. And I think those are some of the things that can tell us about who Kenya was, you know, during the colonial time. Then again, there's the National Museum and the national museums all around Kenya that perhaps host different facts or different artifacts or things from the colonial period. And there's also the National Archives, which is it's a massive building, of course, where a lot of documents and things are stored. But then again, accessing those is very tricky if, you know, you can't prove that you're researching something, if you're not a scholar, if all of those things, and again, having to pay to enter to see them. But yes, those documents are there. Accessing them is difficult. And again, like having them talked about openly or in a consistent fashion is also difficult. So I think those are some of the problems we face with the current archive that we have. And again, the fact that there is a lot of documentation that is held abroad in Britain, and that is really not that accessible to Kenyans here. So I think those are some of the difficulties we have with our national archives.
Thank you so much. Very, very nice comments from participants. Thank you very much. And I should say that if everyone wants to read more about what about your writing, about your text as well that you wrote in response to the Karen Blixen archive, on the Messon's London website, everyone can have access to this text and also to more references should they want to read more about photography, literature, and fiction in general. Thank you so much, Michelle. It was a pleasure to be with you tonight, and thank you to everyone for joining.